They said justice was blind, but in early America, justice had a face, and it looked you right in the eyes before it took your life. Imagine standing in a crowded town square, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dirt, and fear. Children sit on their father's shoulders. Women clutch their bonnets. And in the center of it all stands a wooden scaffold. Rough, creaking timber. A rope swaying gently in the morning breeze. Public executions were once a form of entertainment, a grim spectacle where morality and bloodshed shared the same stage. Before movies, before television, before crime podcasts, this was the show. And the price of admission was simply being alive to watch another human die. The American colonies inherited this taste for punishment from Europe. Back then, execution wasn't just about death, it was about display. Punishment had to be seen to be believed. And for the crowd, it was a lesson. Disobey, and this could be you. But the line between justice and cruelty was thin, and America crossed it many times. The first known execution in the American colonies happened in 1608. Captain George Kendall, accused of spying for Spain, was tied to a post and shot. There were no appeals, no trials as we know them. Just accusation, judgment, and death. Over the next 2 centuries, the methods grew more theatrical. Hanging, burning, shooting, and, on occasion, breaking, where bones were shattered as the condemned begged for mercy that would never come. Executions were community events. Church bells would ring to announce them. Merchants sold food and alcohol. Preachers gave fiery sermons while the condemned prayed, cried, or cursed. And when the trapdoor fell, the crowd cheered, sometimes in horror, sometimes in excitement, but always with fascination. Because deep down, people wanted to see what happened when sin met consequence. One of the earliest and most disturbing of these spectacles took place in 1741 in New York City. That year, panic swept through the colony. A paranoia that enslaved Africans and poor whites were plotting to burn the city down. Over 30 people were executed, most of them black, accused of crimes they never committed. They were burned alive in the public square as crowds gathered to watch. The smell of charred flesh filled the air, and the same crowd that prayed moments earlier shouted amen as the flames rose. History called it the New York Conspiracy Trials. But really, it was a massacre, one of the first examples of America's deep obsession with punishment as performance. By the 1800s, executions had become almost ritualized. Each town had its own gallows, each sheriff his own rope, and each condemned person their own dreadful script. But sometimes that script went wrong. In 1875, a man named John D. Lee was executed by firing squad in Utah for his role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. He was made to sit on a coffin in front of a wall of soldiers. Before they shot him, Lee spoke calmly. "I am sacrificed in a cowardly, dastardly manner." Moments later, 5 rifles cracked, and the snow around him turned red. The execution was filmed, one of the first in American history, and later sold as photographs to the public. A dead man's image, traded like a souvenir. Executions were often treated as moral theater, meant to cleanse the community of sin. But the morality was an illusion. Many condemned weren't guilty. And even those who were, often didn't deserve how they died. In 1890, America sought a more humane way to kill and invented the electric chair. It was supposed to be swift, clean, and modern. But the first use of it, on a man named William Kemmler, was anything but humane. Witnesses described sparks flying from his head. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber. His body convulsed for minutes before the doctor declared him dead. And when the lights flickered back on, reporters fainted. The humane method had become something far worse, torture disguised as progress. Yet despite the horror, states across America adopted it almost immediately. Because if you called it science, you didn't have to call it cruelty. The 20th century would only refine that cruelty. Electrocution gave way to gas chambers, another civilized method. And with them came the same empty promises: painless, efficient, humane. But those promises rarely held true. In 1924, Nevada executed Ji John, a Chinese immigrant convicted of murder. He became the first person in U.S. history to die in a gas chamber. Witnesses said he thrashed violently as the gas filled the room. The experiment, meant to be silent, became another spectacle of human suffering. America called it innovation. But to those who watched, it looked more like madness with a metal door. By mid-century, executions had moved behind prison walls. The public no longer watched, at least not in person. But curiosity never disappeared. Newspapers described every detail. What the condemned ate, what they said, whether they cried or smiled. Reporters fought for front-row seats. The audience was still there, just reading instead of cheering. Some of those stories became legend, like that of Ruth Snyder, executed in 1928 for killing her husband. A hidden camera captured the moment the current hit her body, and the image ran on the front page of the New York Daily News. It became one of the most infamous photographs in American history. Her death, and the photo of it, sold more papers than any headline that week. And in that moment, the line between justice and entertainment blurred forever. But executions weren't always clean, or quick, or certain. They were often ugly, chaotic, and deeply human, full of mistakes. Ropes snapped, switches failed, doctors miscalculated doses. People caught fire, suffocated, burned from the inside out. And every time, officials would promise to improve the system. But the system itself was the problem. One man, Jesse Taferel, was executed in Florida's electric chair in 1990. The sponge between his head and the electrodes had been dried out, a mistake that caused flames to erupt from his skull. It took 3 jolts of electricity before he finally died. The smell of his burning hair lingered for hours. Even in an era of science and progress, America hasn't escaped its brutal roots. It had only hidden them better. If you strip away the laws and the ceremony, what remains is a simple truth. Execution, no matter how you dress it up, is violence. It's the state deciding who deserves to live and who doesn't. And throughout history, those decisions have been anything but fair. People of color, the poor, the mentally ill, the powerless. They've always filled America's death rows. Not because they were the most dangerous, but because they were the easiest to condemn. The gallows, the chair, the needle, all have served the same purpose: control. A message to the masses that order must be kept, even if it requires cruelty. Some of the most disturbing executions weren't famous because of how people died, but because of how they lived until that moment. Prisoners isolated for years, stripped of hope, waiting for a knock on the door that would end everything. The slow psychological torture was as effective as any rope. Imagine lying in a concrete cell, counting days you don't want to reach, hearing the distant sound of footsteps, the metallic click of a key, and knowing one day those sounds will come for you. That was the daily reality for hundreds across American prisons. And for many, it still is. Today, execution is rare, at least compared to the past. Most Americans will never witness one. But the history remains, buried under layers of legal language and moral debate. From the hanging trees of colonial America to the sterile rooms of modern prisons, the ritual hasn't changed. Only the tools have. And behind every sanitized phrase, lethal injection, capital punishment, final sentence, there's a person. Someone who once breathed, loved, feared, and waited. Whether guilty or not, they remind us of something America has always struggled to face. That justice, when mixed with vengeance, can turn into something monstrous. By the middle of the 20th century, America had learned how to make death look respectable. Gone were the public gallows, the crowds, the chaos. Now death came in silence, inside gray rooms with tile floors and buzzing fluorescent lights. It was supposed to be cleaner, quieter, and moral. But under that sterile surface, the cruelty still pulsed. After World War II, a new question began to haunt the American conscience. Could a country that had just fought fascism still justify state-sponsored killing? The answer, for many, was yes, but the methods began to change. The electric chair and the gas chamber still dominated. But behind closed doors, governors and wardens wanted something that wouldn't make headlines. Something that looked humane enough to soothe the public's guilt. That's when science stepped in once again, not to heal, but to kill. In the 1970s, a man named J. Chapman, an Oklahoma medical examiner, proposed what he called a scientific solution. He called it lethal injection, a sequence of chemicals that would supposedly end life painlessly. The process sounded almost merciful. One drug to sedate, one to paralyze, one to stop the heart. It was sold as clean, quick, and efficient. No smoke, no burning, no screaming. Just sleep. But as history had already proven, America's idea of humane execution always looked better on paper than it did in practice. The first lethal injection took place in 1982. A man named Charles Brooks Jr. lay strapped to a gurney in Texas, and 4 taped to his arm. Witnesses said he smiled faintly, whispered a prayer, and closed his eyes. Minutes later, he was gone. The procedure seemed peaceful, but over time, cracks began to show. Needles missed veins, drugs failed. Prisoners gasped for air. Some convulsed for 20 minutes or more, as witnesses watched in horror. The so-called modern method had simply given old cruelty a new disguise. As America pushed deeper into the 1980s and 1990s, the death penalty became a mirror of politics and power. Executions weren't just punishments anymore. They were symbols. Candidates bragged about being tough on crime. Governors refused clemency to appear strong. And every execution became a televised performance of authority. But in the shadow of those headlines were stories no one wanted to hear. Stories of the condemned who were innocent. In 1989, a man named Randall Dale Adams walked free from Texas's death row after 12 years. He'd been convicted based on a teenage arrest lie, a lie that unraveled too late for the truth to matter. Adams was one of dozens who would later be proven innocent through DNA testing. The more the system killed, the more doubt began to spread. The justice America had built on certainty began to tremble under the weight of human error. For some, the horror wasn't that executions happened. It was that they happened to the wrong people. Take the case of George Stinney Jr. In 1944, he was just 14 years old when he was executed in South Carolina, the youngest person ever put to death in modern American history. His crime? Allegedly killing 2 white girls. His trial lasted less than 3 hours. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes, and when he was led to the electric chair, the helmet barely fit his small head. Witnesses said he was so light, the current lifted him off the seat. Decades later, the state admitted the truth. There was no evidence. George was innocent, but his grave had already been filled. These stories chipped away at the moral armor of capital punishment. By the late 20th century, activists and journalists were exposing flaws: racism in sentencing, botched executions, corruption in courts. Documentaries and reports began showing what the public hadn't seen since the 1800s. That death in America was still ugly. It still burned, bled, and broke. And now it did so in the name of law and order. In 1997, Pedro Medina was executed in Florida's electric chair. The moment the switch was flipped, flames erupted from his head. The stench of burning flesh filled the chamber. It was the second time that it happened in the same state. Reporters called it barbaric. Officials called it a technical malfunction. Each time it went wrong, the state promised improvement. Each time, it failed again. By the turn of the millennium, the death penalty faced its greatest challenge in modern history. Not from lawmakers, but from science. DNA evidence had begun freeing the condemned, exposing wrongful convictions one after another. Innocent people had been killed, and those still on death row could now prove they'd been framed, misidentified, or betrayed by bad lawyering. For the first time, the American public began to see execution not as justice, but as a gamble, and the stakes were human lives. Governors like Illinois' George Ryan halted all executions in their states. Ryan said, "I cannot support a system that has come so close to the ultimate horror, the execution of an innocent man." It was a rare moment of truth in a history built on denial. But not everyone wanted to stop. Some states doubled down, perfecting secrecy instead of transparency. Pharmaceutical companies stopped selling drugs for executions, forcing prisons to experiment with untested chemicals. Executions became even more unpredictable and horrifying. In 2014, an inmate named Clayton Lockett was injected with a new experimental drug cocktail in Oklahoma. The procedure should have taken minutes. Instead, it took 43. Lockett writhed, groaned, and tried to speak as his body slowly shut down. Officials closed the curtain halfway through, but not before witnesses saw what America's civilized system really looked like. Afterward, the state called it an isolated incident. But reports revealed dozens of similar cases across the country. Needles blown out of veins, inmates suffocating while paralyzed, doctors refusing to participate. It was the same old horror story, just retold under fluorescent light. At this point, America stood divided. Half the country saw execution as justice served. The other half saw it as a national shame. The death penalty had become a reflection of America itself, its violence, its fear, its hypocrisy. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to find justice in any of it. Because beneath every method, whether it's the rope, the chair, the gas, or the needle, there's one undeniable truth. The act of execution is not about reform. It's about control. And in America, control has always been unevenly applied. Black men sentenced to death at 5 times the rate of white men. The poor denied appeals because they couldn't afford lawyers. People with severe mental illness strapped down and silenced instead of treated. These are not accidents. They are the foundation the system was built on. By the end of the 20th century, the death penalty was losing its grip, but not its shadow. It lingered in public debate, political speeches, and prison corridors. Each execution felt both archaic and modern, a relic of a country still learning how to face its own brutality. When Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, was executed by lethal injection in 2001, it was broadcast live via closed circuit. Over 200 people watched as he took his final breath. Some called it justice. Others called it revenge. But one thing was clear. America still needed to see death to believe in closure. Even in silence, the spectacle remained. Justice, it seems, has always been less about what's right and more about what feels right. And for centuries, America's idea of justice has been tied to blood, to punishment, to making an example out of someone. In the end, execution says more about the living than the dead. It reveals what kind of society we are, one that believes peace can come from pain, that morality can be restored through death. But history tells us otherwise. From the gallows to the gurney, every so-called humane execution has only been another step in a centuries-old dance between vengeance and virtue. And every step leaves a stain that never quite fades. The 21st century was supposed to be the age of progress, of justice refined by technology, of morality guided by truth. And yet, even as DNA cleared the innocent and data exposed systemic bias, America still found itself strapping people to gurneys and calling it order. The killing continued. Only now, it was hidden behind bureaucracy, euphemisms, and court orders. The death chamber had become an institution, cold, bureaucratic, sanitized. And in that silence, the old ghosts still whispered. The new millennium didn't just bring new technology, it brought new scrutiny. For the first time, the internet gave the public access to court records, execution footage, autopsy reports. The world could finally see what had long been hidden in the dark corners of American justice. Images of botched executions went viral. Investigative journalists uncovered chemical suppliers using fake names, states smuggling lethal drugs through shell companies overseas. The humane system had turned into something darker, a black market of death. Pharmaceutical companies, horrified by their drugs being used to kill, began cutting off supplies. States responded by improvising their own formulas. Each time, the results were unpredictable. Inmates gasped, convulsed, and lingered for excruciating minutes. In one 2018 case, Doyle Ham lay on the table for 2 hours while executioners tried and failed to find a vein. They punctured his bladder, his groin, his leg. He bled as they searched. The execution was finally called off, but not out of mercy. It was simply too late in the evening. That night, America learned the truth. Even when it fails to kill, the system doesn't stop trying. Public opinion began to shift. The death penalty, once a symbol of justice, started to look more like a relic. A growing number of Americans began asking a forbidden question. What if the state has no right to kill at all? But old habits die hard, especially when they're written into law. Politicians still used executions to signal strength. Prosecutors still pursued death sentences to appear tough. And for the families of victims, execution was still marketed as closure, a final act of balance in a world that had taken too much. Yet even they began to notice something strange. After the executions, closure didn't always come. Grief didn't vanish. Anger didn't fade. The hole stayed the same size, only deeper. Because vengeance, no matter how official, never truly fills the void. By the 2020s, the map of death had changed. Half the states had abolished the death penalty outright. Others hadn't executed anyone in decades, even if the law still allowed it. But a small handful of states, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Oklahoma, kept the machinery running, year after year, method after method. Each execution was another test of moral endurance. In some states, firing squads were quietly reintroduced. Officials claimed it was more reliable, not more humane. One prisoner requested the firing squad because he feared botched injections. Think about that. A man choosing to be shot because he believed it would hurt less than what the state called painless. And as the world watched, America seemed stuck in time. A modern nation still practicing medieval rituals under fluorescent light. Outside the prisons, protests grew. Priests, scientists, victims' families, even former executioners began to speak out. One warden described what it was like to give the final nod, to watch the light leave a man's eyes, then go home and eat dinner with his family. He said the system didn't just kill the condemned. It killed something inside everyone who took part. Psychologists began calling it executioner's trauma, the guilt, the nightmares, the insomnia, the feeling of becoming the very thing justice was supposed to prevent. It was proof that killing, even by law, always leaves a scar, not just on the body, but on the nation's soul. In 2020, the federal government brought executions back after 17 years of silence. Over 6 months, 10 men were executed. Most of them had spent decades on death row. Each one's death reignited the same debate. Is this justice? Or just ritualized revenge? The timing was no accident. The executions happened quietly, during a pandemic, when the world was distracted. But behind closed doors, witnesses reported terrifying scenes. Needles slipping, inmates choking, chemicals burning through lungs. The official statements said the deaths were peaceful, but the autopsies told a different story. Meanwhile, other countries, from the UK to Canada, from France to Australia, began condemning the United States for clinging to a punishment they had long left behind. In Europe, even the death penalty's mention was considered barbaric. In America, it was still debated like policy, not morality. The United Nations called it a stain on human rights, but the US stood firm, insisting it was a matter of justice, of sovereignty. A nation that once declared, "All men are created equal," still kept the machinery of death humming. The paradox was complete. Yet even within the system, something began to shift. Jurors grew hesitant to hand out death sentences. Judges questioned its fairness. And prosecutors, facing public pressure, started choosing life sentences instead. Not out of mercy, but out of doubt. Doubt had become the greatest weapon against execution. Because once you begin to question its certainty, everything unravels. The system can't function without faith. And America, after centuries of killing in the name of justice, was beginning to lose faith. Still, the question remains, why does it persist? Why does the most powerful democracy on earth still need to kill? Maybe because execution has never really been about crime. Maybe it's about control, a ritual of dominance dressed up as justice. A way for society to convince itself that order can be restored through suffering. But deep down, every execution exposes the same truth. It doesn't fix what's broken. It just adds another name to the list of the dead. In 2022, Alabama tried to execute Kenneth Smith by lethal injection and failed. For hours, they jabbed at his body, searching for a vein. He screamed in pain. They called it off again. Then a year later, they tried something new, nitrogen gas. They called it innovative. He was the first person in history to be executed that way. Witnesses said he thrashed, convulsed, and gasped for air for several minutes. Officials described it as successful. The cruelty had simply evolved. The horror had gone high-tech. The deeper you look, the more the story stops being about the condemned and starts being about the society that condemns. Every method, every reform, every promise of humanity leads back to the same conclusion. There's no clean way to kill a human being. Not with science, not with law, not with faith. Each attempt only proves the same thing, that execution is not justice perfected, but justice corrupted. And yet, even now, in the 21st century, the death chamber door still closes behind someone every few months. A switch is flipped, a needle slides in, a witness watches, and somewhere, on a piece of paper, the word justice is written beside the time of death. But history will remember it differently. Because centuries from now, when people look back on the age of American executions, they won't see order or morality. They'll see a nation wrestling with its own reflection, a country that built its sense of justice on punishment and never learned how to let go of its need to destroy what it fears. And in that reflection, one truth will always remain. The most disturbing executions in American history are not just the ones that went wrong, but the ones that went exactly as planned.